This is a podcast on sustainability, climate, business, economy, and tech. This is your host, Seema Arora. Today, I have a very special guest. It's an absolute honor and privilege to have this guest on my show. His name is Mr. William K. Reilly, and he has had a very distinguished career in public service and non-governmental organizations and private sector finance. He has served 4 US presidents, including President Nixon, President George H.W. Bush, President Clinton and President Obama, and has had a lasting impact in terms of the environmental policy he architected while serving as the US Administrator under President Bush. He has also served in the NGO community and his role at the World Wildlife Fund as well as Conservation International, where he was president and then chairman of the board. Mr. Reilly then found his calling in private sector finance, and he was the founding partner of Aqua International Partners, a private equity fund dedicated to investing in companies in the water sector. Mr. Reilly, it's such an honor to have you, and I would love to delve into your background and welcome you first of all. So great to have you.
It's great and a privilege to be your guest, Seema. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is a dream come true. We've been talking about this for a while, and finally it's happening. So let me start off, first of all, with your stellar education and your childhood. You were born into a religious, conservative family, and take me from there to how you got to Yale, then to Harvard, and then to Columbia. What a journey. I mean, you've done it all, right?
I look back at my choices and realize they were not the product of a lot of calculation and or at least as far as I was aware. I was a Midwesterner in Decatur, Illinois, and when I was 10 years old, my father had financial problems because he was in the steel business and there was a huge, very long steel strike. So we went down to southern Texas and he spent a couple of years there as a contractor. And his offense there was that he employed wetbacks, as they were called at the time, which is a pejorative now, but they were undocumented residents of colonias, these very poor communities on the Mexican border that had little or no sanitation, therefore had, and I believe still have, the highest gastrointestinal sickness or problems of any population in the country. Well, he paid them too much, and the contractor community was not happy with that. And he was kind of frozen out, and so that was not a success. And finally, we went back to northern Illinois, and I completed 7th and 8th grade there. And then, because he had serious ulcer issues, and he had a very serious operation, 2/3 of his stomach removed, we moved to live with his sister in Fall River, Massachusetts, and I started high school there. And it turned out that when my mother went back to join him in Illinois as he was beginning his business again, I was left in Decatur, in Fall River, and I quite loved the environment there. It was a very multicultural environment. There were something like 30 Portuguese-speaking Catholic churches and just as many French-speaking and Italian-speaking. And there were Syrians and Jews and Lebanese. The Lebanese Rite bishop, the only in the United States, the Maronite Rite bishop who was on the altar at President Kennedy's funeral, was a bishop there, a resident there. So I developed the idea that I wanted to go to Yale. And, I see my daughters and their very careful assessment of the office of different universities before they made their choice. They finally did both choose Yale over Harvard and over Stanford. Their mother suggested our older daughter not go to Harvard. She said, it's not the place for you. It's a very individualistic place. It's not so much of a family place, but Yale was different. But anyway, I remember when I was interviewed for Yale, I was asked by the assistant dean of admissions, how did you get here today? You're the only person without a parent
Yeah.
that I have interviewed. And I said, I hitchhiked. And he said, you hitchhiked from Massachusetts. Yes, it's not that long a hitchhike. I've
Yeah.
hitchhiked more in other places. And then he said, where else have you applied? And I said, nowhere. He
Yeah.
said, you aware of our admit rate? I said, yeah, I really want to go to Yale. So,
Yeah.
a lot of this was serendipity, honestly. I just was very lucky. I got into Yale, and I think it somewhat changed my life. I then spent my junior year in France, and whether I was an internationalist already, because I did definitely choose Yale because it had a
Yeah.
good Paris third year program, and and I started on my way, and then went to the Sciences Po and Catholic Institute in Paris, and finally Harvard Law School, and in the Army went to three schools: the Infantry Officers School in Fort Benning, Georgia,
Yeah.
and two others. So it was a long preparation. And I remember when I finished the Army tour, my father asked me what I was going to do, and I said I'm going to go to Columbia in urban planning. And he said,
Yeah.
well, that's good, son. And you get to be at about 45, 46, 47, you'll have this education thing knocked. And so, but he later came around and decided that was a good thing. I went to urban planning school because I wanted to be used if I went back in my law firm in their planning practice.
Yeah.
Well, then I was for a brief time after I graduated from law school, I was in a law firm, the senior partner of which was one of the renowned land use lawyers in the country, Richard Babcock.
Yeah.
And John Ehrlichman, who was assistant to President Nixon for domestic policy, called him up. And they were both land use lawyers, although Babcock was a Democrat, and asked for an advice about someone who could write the National Land Use Policy Act.
Okay.
I was recommended. And so hence I found myself working in the Nixon White House. I was the fourth hire on the Council on Environmental Quality under Russell Train,
Yeah.
and had a wonderful time. It was one of these moments, and I often think it would be good advice to young people generally. You may not know when you're in your moment,
Yeah.
may not know that this is as good as it may ever get.
Yes.
Period of the Environmental Rally, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, an
Right.
astonishing array
Yeah.
of, of statutes expressing the aspirations of the country in a very united way with strong bipartisan support in the Congress. And of course, that moment was not to come again for, well, until the Clean Air Act under President George H.W. Bush, when we summoned up the same kind of energies and had a lopsided victory in the House and
Yeah.
the and reformed the Clean Air Act and cleaned up
And
acid rain and any
yeah.
number of pending
Yeah.
problems. That's a
Yes.
long, probably longer answer than you wanted.
No, definitely. You had gone to Columbia and done your dissertation or your master's in land use. Is that correct?
That's correct. Urban planning,
In
yes.
urban planning. And then at the Nixon administration, as you said, there was a lot of bipartisan support at the time and rallying behind the cause of the environment, also because of a lot of activism surrounding the DDT and the insecticides, and there was a lot of citizen involvement as well, right? And is that how President Nixon took it upon himself? Because, first of all, I think it would be an interesting revelation for a lot of people who are not familiar with the history of sustainability that
Yes.
it was under President Nixon that the reorganization plan that brought the,
Environmental protection, the Ice Council, yes,
yeah,
which created EPA.
and the National Environmental Policy and the Council on Environmental Quality, of which you became a fourth
Yes,
hire, as you mentioned. So, literally, this was avant garde kind of policy making, right?
it was. And the origin of it was apparently, as far as I'm aware, I'm pretty sure this is correct, that Nixon read a poll of the American people in,
Okay.
in 1968.
Yeah.
And the top three issues of concern to the country were
Yeah.
the war in Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
the economy, and the
Yeah.
environment. Well, the environment had never played in that league before.
Yeah.
And Nixon said to his subordinates, his team, I want to get out front on the environment.
Hmm.
So he was very conscious before he was elected that that would be one of his signal issues.
Yeah.
Sometime after he was elected, he sat down with his yellow pad and his pen, and he listed 12 principal issues.
Okay.
And the top four issues, he said, I want to be involved in everything that moves with respect to these issues. I don't know what they are,
Yeah.
but one can surmise that relations with China was right up there.
Hmm.
And he said, with respect to the rest of the issues, I want this administration to be forward leaning.
Yes.
I want you to make sure that it is, not bother me unless there's something that only I, as president, can be involved with.
Yeah.
But I want to establish a very strong record on the environment. So that was honored by his team, by his staff. He and he kept his word. Now, the
Yeah.
extraordinary thing about Richard Nixon
Yeah.
is that he was a fellow from the world of national security and foreign affairs, and that was
Hmm.
his specialty, and that was his interest. That's where his heart was.
Yeah.
He did some very significant things domestically, but those were less intimately important to him. The interesting thing with respect to the environment is that personally, he did not particularly sympathize with environmentalists,
Yeah.
and later came to see them as part of the anti-war crowd who were tearing the country down, and didn't necessarily have a feel for those issues.
Yeah.
So much so that although he was very proud of his having signed the National Environmental Policy Act on the first day of January 1970, and he
Yeah.
announced this will be the decade of the environment,
Yes.
the statutes that he signed reflect that he kept his word. He nevertheless, in the middle of early 1972,
Hmm.
had his aide call me and ask me to prepare a speech for Nixon to deliver at the Detroit Economic Club, disavowing the environment. And and I remember saying, but not to tell my boss, not to tell Russell Train or the general counsel. Well, I went right downstairs in my building and told them. And I'll never forget, I said, I'm not going to write that speech. And the general counsel said to me, evidencing a sophistication to which I had not arrived, of course you're going to write it. They could have gone to anyone in the administration to write this speech. They came to you. Someone is looking out for us at the White House. They know you will write a speech we can live with.
Yeah.
Well, so I wrote a speech, and it was all about reconciling environmental aspirations with economic goals. And I think Nixon delivered a paragraph from it. By the time the Detroit speech came along, he had gone on to something else and talked about the economy, which apparently was characteristic of him. He had these momentary outbursts of concern and anxiety, and I just 2 years ago I had a conversation with Henry Kissinger. He explained to me Watergate, and he said Nixon used to say a lot of things that he really didn't mean.
Yeah.
That he said I knew that. He said if I had done everything he had asked me to do, we would have blown up the world, and I
No.
certainly would have lost my job. And he said Haldeman, Ehrlichman, the people close to him, knew not to take him seriously when he was fulminating.
Yeah.
Um, any rate, and he explained Watergate in terms of Chuck Colson not knowing that and getting approval to do the break-in. But had he known Nixon, he would just know enough to set this aside. It's just not something Nixon would want to have happen upon reflection.
Yeah.
But so Nixon established a significant, very important record on the environment, and with misgivings
Yeah.
personally all the time. My boss presented to him the 1971 legislative program, which we were allowed to develop on the environment. That shows how much priority he attached to this. We had that action, and that, of course, gave us tremendous influence in the administration with every other agency.
Yeah.
But he read my section of the legislative program in the presence of my boss, Russell Train. And he said, who's the SOB who wrote this? Now, the extraordinary thing about Nixon,
Yeah.
he changed not a word. he sent that legislative program as it was to the Congress.
Yeah.
And I consider that a great strength. There's a difference of opinion that I have with my mentor and much admired predecessor, Bill Ruckelshaus,
Yeah.
who read a chapter I have written for
Mhm.
my memoir, Nixon and the Environment, in which I state in the concluding sentence, so quite
Yeah.
simply, Richard Nixon was the most consequential president for the environment in the
That's
post World War II period.
yeah.
Well, Ruckelshaus, oh, he just wanted to tear that up. And I had a long meeting with him. And I said, well, he appointed you
Yeah.
and Train and
Yes.
Chris Herter at State.
And then
He
you
did
were there.
The Stockholm Conference. We led this international
Yeah.
environmental movement.
Yeah.
He signed these statutes, and we drafted many of them. And he said yes, but he didn't really. It wasn't. He didn't care about the environment, and he was a terrible man. Well, it turned out that Bill Ruckelshaus had been for some brief period FBI director, and he had listened to all the tapes before it was known. And he said, frankly, I never got over listening to the discussion of felonies in the Oval Office
Yeah.
and the
And he
willing.
resigned. He didn't fire the prosecutor, the independent prosecutor. He
Well,
resigned from the position, right? I mean,
Ruckelshaus was deputy
yeah.
to the deputy attorney general to
Yeah.
Richardson then,
Yeah.
and rather than take the order to fire, they both quit. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
The
But
Saturday Night Massacre, as it was
yeah.
called.
So, I mean, then President Nixon's role was more like a pragmatist, right? He followed the polls and what the people wanted rather than the idealist, right? He didn't care. But
He,
consequential it was, right? In terms of
yeah,
the appointments and the leverage and the freedom to do whatever the committed environmentalists wanted to do. And that was Ruckelshaus and Russell Train and yourself, all of who became important leaders in the environmental movement. I mean, all of you were administrators at some point. So, yeah, I mean, that's great that he let you guys flourish and not intervene too much. It would have been
I
too much effort to counter you.
think he correctly divined the mood of the country,
Yeah,
and something happened in the late '60s. It's very important that there had been for many years, for 100 years at least, an environmental movement that was largely about birds, and there were organizations to protect trees and things of that sort. And they were not politically that strong, but they created the National Audubon Society and some of the other enduring environmental groups. But then along came the health issue and the health mood and the sense that the air pollution was not just a nuisance, but it was impairing people's health.
yeah,
And you had these two waves of public concern, and then a couple of very important environmental crises: the Santa Barbara oil spill,
yes,
the and the burning river in outside of Cleveland, the
yeah,
Cuyahoga River.
yeah,
And those really galvanized opinion. And so they led up to the organization of Earth Day, which the Conservation Foundation was the technical incorporator for.
mhm,
Before my time, I was still in the White House then.
yeah,
And, it was a day that I think the country hadn't seen before, with tens of thousands of people in the streets in New York and Boston and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Chicago. And there were older people
mhm,
and professors and students and working folks. I mean, it was a very unifying enterprise. And I've often looked back at that period. And I'll tell you one thing that really interests me a lot, given the present circumstances.
yeah,
We were not a united country in many respects. I can recall when I came home from the Army, being in Columbia blew up, it was seized by the Students for Democratic Society and shut down, just as it has been more recently. But it
yeah,
was much more serious. The president's office was seized and a number of buildings taken. And
mhm.
finally, the police were called in. The country was very divided.
Oh,
And it's only struck me recently that we overcame that division with respect to one aspiration, and it was the environment.
unifying, yeah. That's very interesting to know.
It's an interesting
Yeah,
example for our current situation. Just because the country is divided as we currently are doesn't mean that there are not some issues on which everybody can agree.
yes. And has to be bipartisan
It
support. Uh,
to get the kind of vast reorganization of statutes that we got with all
yeah,
of the regulations that entail, yes, there had to be, that would not have passed without bipartisanship.
yeah. So after you left the Nixon office, the council, then were you then the president of Conservation International and then World Wildlife Fund?
No, it was the Conservation Foundation. It was not Conservation International. No, in July, I believe it was, maybe June of 1972, I was invited to go over to the White House and asked to become the principal issue speechwriter for the Nixon campaign.
Okay.
And I said no.
Yeah.
And I remember the fellow who I was dealing with, his name Clark, John Clark, was incredulous. He said,
Mhm.
"You know, we're 18 points ahead in the polls. This is a job that will only take about till November,
Yeah.
and you can do a lot worse than have a pleased president in your past." And for some reason, though I was prepared to vote for Nixon and
Hmm.
did twice,
Yeah.
I had a sense that was not going to be a terribly clean campaign.
Hmm.
And I knew the manager, Gary Hart, of the opposing the Democratic campaign for
Hmm.
McGovern. And and I had another offer. And my offer was from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and
Okay.
Lawrence Rockefeller to run a task force on land use and urban growth. So for the next year, that's what I did. I put a team together. We did that. It had a very distinguished membership, and we published our report. It sold 50,000 copies. I was on the Today Show, and it changed my status, I think, as a hot property. And I got a lot of job offers, and the job offer that I accepted was the Conservation Foundation presidency.
Okay. And you were there for how long?
Well, I was there. I was there from 1973 to the time that I went to the Bush administration in January of 1989.
Hmm.
But they merged in 1985 with the World Wildlife Fund, and
Yeah.
so I became president of both institutions, and we ran them side by side. And Russell Train became chairman of the board of both institutions. He had been president of World Wildlife Fund then,
Yeah.
and he was the one who made me the offer.
So Russell Train and you had a shared history for a
You
long
know,
time.
I look back at my life, and I have had almost every job that Russell Train had had, except I was never a judge of the tax court, which he had been in the 60s.
Yeah. Well, you were in the thick of things, right? So Russell Train recommended your name to President H.W. Bush.
I think he did. I think it was difficult for him. Uh, in June of the election year, 1988, Train invited Bill Ruckelshaus to spend some time at Train's house in Hobe Sound, Florida.
Yeah.
And Ruckelshaus said to him, "You know, if our man wins here, he's likely to ask us what we think about EPA." And I would say Reilly.
Yeah.
And he said, and what would you think? And Train said, "Well, we're still completing a merger. It's only about 3.5 years old between these two organizations, Conservation Foundation and World Wildlife Fund. But I certainly would agree. I would stand aside." And he came back from that trip and called me into his office. And he said, he described the conversation. And he said, "What would you do if you were offered EPA?" And I said, "I would say no, because as vice president, President Bush had headed a deregulatory group that was not particularly friendly to the environment. And I didn't think his heart was in it." And Train said, "Well, if given your history and career and your interest, if the president were to offer you a
Yeah.
position, it's very hard for me to imagine you'd say no."
Yeah.
And I went home, and my wife said, "Well, that does it. We're going to EPA."
Yeah.
And so, and that's where it all started.
Yeah.
And there's another story I like even better. I was standing with Barbara Bush and the Queen of the Netherlands in a state dinner that the Queen gave for President Bush, and I was present.
Yeah,
And the Queen, whom I knew because her father was one of the founders of World Wildlife Fund, Prince Bernhard,
yeah.
she said, "Where did you get him?" And I was standing right there. And Barbara said, "Well, for EPA, George just said, I want the best. No politics involved." And everybody said, "If you want the best, you get Reilly." And I thought, I'll take that.
That,
I was constantly asked, "How did you get here?" Because you didn't participate in the campaign. You were not a registered Republican. I was an independent, basically. And everybody else is going to be looking at you in the cabinet room, wondering, what did he do to deserve this? And Russell Train warned me of that. He said, "I know these people around the president. They're not going to be your friends.
yeah,
They don't think he meant it when he said, 'I want to be the environmental president.' They think it was just a trick, a comment that he was making for the campaign."
yeah,
Well, my job, on my job, I did fight it constantly with the White House Chief of Staff, especially. But my view was I had a mission. You don't appoint someone who's been president of the World Wildlife Fund and a lifelong conservationist
yeah.
to to just sit there.
Yes. As you had mentioned, there was a lot of regulations, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the Toxic Substances Control Act, Endangered Species Act, all of which set the tone for protecting the health. The connection between health and the environment was very clear. As you were proposing these, or as EP administrators were proposing these, how much leeway does the administrator have as opposed to the Congress and the president? Um, what does that equation look like?
Well, to some degree, it depends upon the president and the support for the environment that the Congress has.
Yeah.
My experience as EPA administrator was that if I emphasized an issue or provided an interpretation, whether it's the waste laws or the Clean Air Act,
Mm-hmm.
eventually the Congress would begin to sound like me. In
Yeah.
other words, the administrator has a bully pulpit. He has capacity to set the tone,
Okay.
because it's full time for the administrators, not full time for anybody in the Congress,
Yeah.
and that is a very useful piece of authority, and
Mm-hmm.
not everyone exploits it, I think. But I viewed the Environmental Protection Agency administratorship as a communications job, a challenge, as
Mm-hmm.
much as anything else. The
Yeah.
country had to have two things. The country had to believe that the work was valid, important, even
Yeah.
essential, and it also had to trust the agency.
Mm-hmm.
Those two things were absolutely crucial. If
Yeah.
either one had been missing, it would not have worked.
Okay. Is the EP administrator cabinet rank?
The administrator has more power than all of the domestic cabinet members,
Is that right?
but it is not in the cabinet, as John Dingell said. It is not, and it never will be, and it will be over my dead body. And so, he was opposed to it. President George H.W. Bush was also opposed to it, but largely for reasons of clutter and organization. He didn't. He thought there were. I think he thought there were too many cabinet officers. He didn't want to add to it. The Veterans Administration, I think, had been the most recent one,
Yeah.
and it. I remember Senator Moynihan saying that George Bush doesn't understand the cabinet structure. It's not a decision making body. It's not anything that he need to worry about cluttering up.
Yeah.
It's a communications a possibility on a regular basis for the president to set the tone, to make corrections sometimes, to say something is being misunderstood by the public. You got to deal with it.
Yeah.
But he was not in favor and he told me right from the beginning that he would not support that. And I was okay with it. I had all of the authority of those statutes,
Yeah.
and huge impact on the culture and the economy of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but just coming back to the early part of the 80s, there was a lot of deregulation going on within the EPA. Is that a correct inference?
Yes, it is. It was the intention, and quite explicitly so, of the Reagan administration
Yeah.
to deregulate, and Ann Gorsuch set out to do that, and so did James Watt to the extent that he had laws and regulations to administer.
Hmm. 1980, the Bhopal tragedy in India immediately sends a sense of alarm across the US. And there were a lot of worker right to know laws and community right to know laws at the state level that were happening. And the Bhopal events catalyzed this movement, and a federal law was passed, which was an amendment to the circular, which is the Superfund, which required all facilities to make public their releases of toxic emissions. It was purely a planning motivation that communities should know that in the event of an accident, what are the chemicals that are being emitted in those neighborhoods, how people are exposed to it. And this was during the Reagan administration under Lee Thomas that this law was passed. But that in turn then had quite a remarkable effect in terms of, because it became more like an Information Disclosure Act. 1986, this act was passed, and it required all facilities to then make public their releases into air, land, and water. It was during your administration in 1991 when this emissions profile was released. There were ads in the New York Times, and NRDC, which is the NGO in Washington, also came out with, which companies are polluting the most and which are the leaders and doing better. And this then led to, am I following this line of reasoning correct, that then you were approached by the company's CEOs to try to make amends and come up with a voluntary approach to environmental regulations?
Well, everything you have said is correct except the last part. The
Yeah.
CEOs did not approach me asking for a voluntary program.
Hmm.
I responded by giving them one. One thing,
Okay.
one thing to note about the requirement, the right to know
Hmm.
about pollution emissions, and particularly hazardous emissions, is that these emissions were largely not regulated. They were below the level of regulatory concern.
Okay.
So it wasn't a case where EPA could suddenly clamp down on them. They were not. They were not disobeying the law.
Okay.
However, I happened to go up to Congress just after the law was the publication occurred
Hmm.
of the findings,
Yeah.
and every congressional office I was in, there was the local newspaper with headlines of who the malefactor was in their community.
Yeah.
Well, it was a groundswell that resulted of sensitivity, of bad publicity, of
Yeah.
concern, and it put the environment, and particularly toxics, into the chain of priorities.
Yes.
So that it set the stage, honestly, for my title, the toxics title of the Clean Air Act amendments that I proposed, that President Bush proposed
Yeah.
in 1990.
Uh-huh. Okay. And going along the theme of the voluntary programs, so you invited companies to reduce
Well,
emissions.
well, I prescribed it. It took better part of a year to get the Office of Management and Budget to agree. And I remember at the time thinking, you guys over there have really got to distrust EPA. I have a voluntary program, which you're saying is possibly a suspect, and
Yeah.
all it requires is that the truth be told,
Yeah.
details be submitted. And I had a number of conversations. I always had close communications with the CEOs, and I remember talking to the CEO of Monsanto,
Yeah.
and he said,
J&B.
when we had to compile
Yeah.
the list, the burden of pollutants that we were responsible for, I had no idea that so many high value products were going up the chimney.
Mm-hmm.
He learned from it and
Yeah.
made efficiency results. Well, my program was 3350. It said
Yes.
basically get these emissions down
Mm-hmm.
by 33%, by a third within
Yeah.
5 years, and by the
50.
end of the decade, get
Yeah.
them to 50% reductions. And I'll never forget when I left EPA, I joined the board of DuPont, and the CEO of DuPont, Edgar Woolard, said, "You made only one mistake."
Yeah.
He said, "You set the standard too
Too
low."
low.
We went much higher. He said, "We got 88% reductions." And
Yeah.
so I was amused by that, but they were a leader and they wanted to be a leader. And all of a sudden, companies were given a an incentive, a performance review. And I later went to China to advise them on the creation of a new EPA. And
Yeah.
I had in the room all of the people who were writing the laws and regulations there. They're mostly relatively younger
Yeah.
people, not at the ministerial level. And they asked me, they knew about 3350. I guess at first they didn't, but a young person from WWF, a young woman, said, "You might explain to us your voluntary programs." And I explained 3350. And they said, "And what did you give? What did they get
Yeah.
for joining your program?" And I said, almost embarrassed, a nice letter from me and a flag to fly over their plants.
Yeah.
And they all began to write furiously. They said, "That could work in China.
Yeah.
Could work in China."
Yeah.
And it works in the United States. Well, and it didn't just work with respect to toxics. The Energy Star, I don't know how many buildings, I don't think any buildings, significant buildings, have been constructed since that period that
Yeah.
do carry the
Mm-hmm.
standard of Energy Star.
Yeah.
That was another voluntary program. And I recall a developer saying to me, "The strongest law you have is not even a law." He
Yeah.
said, "As far as I'm concerned," and he was the man who built the stadium in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "You cannot, in California at least, get lending from a bank
Yeah.
if your building is not going to be Energy Star compliant."
Right.
Well, that's the power of the country, really, of the community, of public concern for the environment.
Yeah.
Going back to the 70s, that concern was severely tested during the oil embargo. And Russell Train, the second administrator's proudest achievement was to have steered the agency steadily through the course without in any way backing down on regulatory aspirations
Mm-hmm.
through that period, because it was a period of very high inflation
Yeah.
and economic distress. So the country stayed with it. That had a very strong impact on the Reagan administration,
Yeah.
especially after their try at deregulation. It did not work very well, and the assistant administrator for waste went to prison, and Gorsuch basically was ushered out of her office.
Yeah.
So that led to the White House instructing Lee Thomas, as I understand it, to
Yeah.
keep the agency out of the newspaper,
And
and I guess that that satisfied the White House. They just didn't want any more publicity, but they did learn a lesson that the scandal at the EPA, or consorting with the industry, which is what the assistant administrator was indicted for,
mm-hmm.
was a no-no.
Yeah.
So that was very helpful to uh, the agency, to the environment, and it was very important to Bob Teeter, who was the chief pollster for George H.W. Bush, when he was able to say to the campaign, "The environment has entered the DNA of the American public.
Yeah.
They're not going to want these statutes relaxed. In fact, a good proportion of the public, something in the 80%, wants to keep them or make them stronger."
Better. Yeah. Yeah. No, so definitely, keeping the laws in place is a good idea. It's progress, right? And we cannot just go back on those. But the idea that sometimes the laws can be misplaced. So, I'm trying to go from the command and control kind of regulations to
Yes.
more flexible, market based, even voluntary, because even the voluntary programs basically, when I was assessing the 3350 program, when I was doing my, my graduate work, and which is how I got to work with some folks at the EPA Air and Radiation Office. Our assessment was at the time that these were more flexible market based ways in which companies could choose how to reduce their pollution. It resulted in innovation. It also resulted in, bragging points, right? Public recognition.
Yes.
So immediately, companies started to say that, hey, we reduce these emissions even beyond, and exactly to the point that Richard Mahoney made, was that we made the reductions, or DuPont, that we made reductions even more than what the EPA has recommended. And in part, during the assessment or during the research, we looked at claims of greenwashing, right? Were companies actually doing it or just saying? Secondly, were they kind of compromising on the mandatory regulations and instead focusing on the more attractive voluntary regulations, which they could advertise that, hey, we are doing more than what we are required to do? But in the end, it did turn out that all results pointed to the fact that, A, the large polluters were really into participation in these programs. And these were the polluters that mattered most, the DuPonts and the Dows, which were the big players at the time. If they are participating in these programs and making the reductions, then the battle is won already, right? And also, what kind of industries were attracting these kind of gains in public, pollution reduction. So I think moving along this line, then what is happening right now, in terms of uh, the carbon disclosure, how much CO2 is being emitted, this is entirely based on voluntary frameworks right now and voluntary standards.
Well, but let's be clear.
Yeah.
You can't greenwash if there is a
No.
federal law which requires you to monitor, measure, and report your emissions.
Yeah.
You can't make it up because if you do, you're violating the law. So while we say it's voluntary to join the program,
Mhm.
it's not voluntary to report what your emissions are.
Okay, so they're still subject to enforcement from the EPA.
Yes, yes. If the they can't, since that law went into effect, it's a brilliant act. It's just does so much to use the weight of public opinion, which is
Mhm.
supportive of the environment,
Yeah.
toward the enforcement of laws. And it was ingenious of largely Henry Waxman to conceive it and get it through the Congress.
Mhm. I think another thing that it did was, all of a sudden, because we've always heard that EPA has low enforcement budgets, right? That's the first thing that goes when a president takes over who doesn't care about the environment. But the enforcement action was then given away to the NGO community, the communities, because all of a sudden we had the toxics release inventory, which is the public disclosure system,
Yes,
and companies could actually, or even like activists could look at that profile, researchers could look at that profile and say, hey, these emissions are going down or up. So the while the EPA is doing its enforcement, there's a whole ecosystem, so to say,
it's
of.
that's very well put. You know, at the same meeting that I described when I was in China,
Yeah.
the the members of the regulatory body in China, which was very thin at that time, they were trying to strengthen it, but they didn't have that much power. They asked me, they said, how did you get the states to comply with your laws?
Hmm.
We can't get them to do anything
Yeah.
here from Beijing. And I said, I began to go through the list and I said, well, we had the courts.
Hmm.
And they said, well, that we don't. That's not a viable alternative for us. Well, we had the press. Well, again,
Yes.
it's not easy for us to
Yeah.
depend on the press here. I said we had public opinion
Hmm.
that was mobilized, and particularly effectively by non-governmental organizations who filed lawsuits and publicized failings. Well, we don't have that apparatus, and as I went through that, I really was reminded that we didn't do anything alone. We at EPA, the country did it.
Yeah.
Elements of this, of the press and the public and non-governmental organizations and the courts were all absolutely critical.
Yeah.
The environmental laws. In fact, going back to the National Environmental Policy Act and environmental impact assessment, my first job at the White House Council on Environmental Quality under President Nixon was to explain the functioning of the new law with respect to environmental impact statements. Always before, major projects, infrastructure projects, would have engineering analyses and ideas and plans. It would have cost estimates and commitments. Nothing about the environment, though.
Mm-hmm.
But that changed with the National Environmental Policy Act. So
Yeah.
I was explaining that. Well, hardly anybody was showing up in the federal agencies I went to
Yeah.
with the General Counsel, Timothy Atkinson. And then all of a sudden, that changed. It changed because of a decision that was made and a letter that was put on my desk. And it enjoined permitting for the Alaska pipeline. We're talking a 700-mile pipeline that all of a sudden is forbidden to go forward because of two things: failure to respect the minimum width or maximum width, I guess it was, permitted under Mineral Leasing Act. But then in the judge's own hand, it said failure to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, Section 1022C. Well, the next day, the Undersecretary of Agriculture and all of the top officials were in the room, everybody but the secretary, when my boss and I went over to explain the law. And I recall the question was asked, does this law apply to PL 490?
Yeah.
And I remember that my boss is a very elegant and erudite man, and he pondered for a moment. He said, I can't think of a reason why it wouldn't. And as soon as we were outside, he turned to me, he said, what's PL 490? Anyway, it changed everything. Well, we rejected the next environmental impact statement that the Interior Department prepared. It was thin gruel. It wasn't really serious. And finally, and that was not approved by the court either. So finally they got in serious business, and they created a multi-volume report that analyzed what the pipeline really entailed. It was going to cross something like 7 rivers, which was very tricky. It was going to be in permafrost, which also made complications for pipes. And that was the beginning. From then on, the council was taken very seriously by the other agencies because it was our regulations. It was regulations I helped write that controlled. That changed everything.
Yeah. So basically, you gained a lot of partners who kind of helped you in the enforcement.
Absolutely.
And that was, across agencies and across the public and the NGO community. And I guess that's then the flavor of the voluntary.
And when President Nixon gave the order, which he didn't follow through on, that we write a speech disavowing the environment, it was probably environmental impact assessment that those statements that got on his nerves, because we produced one on the or made the Transportation Department produce one on what was called the SST, the supersonic transport, which was close to the heart of Secretary of Transportation Volpe and to the president. And it was critical. And we did the same thing with respect to a nuclear explosion, a test explosion in Amchitka, Alaska. And that was a very sensitive matter. And I remember much of it, what we wrote on it was redacted. But it was as though the president all of a sudden saw the environment was affecting things that he cared much more about, such as nuclear energy and nuclear security. So that it has been exploited, the environmental impact assessment process. It was a gift of tremendous value to attorneys and to opponents of projects, and is right now holding up the extension of the grid, electricity grid in the United States, and making it more difficult for the Inflation Reduction Act, the climate law, to be implemented. And I'd be first to grant that that is happening and is a consequence of a lot of the checks and balances that are built into that law.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can talk about this later, but the resurgence of nuclear energy being now used and actively funded under the IRA. Um, I I wondered, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, was that never going to be part of, or that always stays separate?
The,
The
the,
environmental aspects of the radio waste, who is regulating that?
well, we at EPA regulated radioactive waste and radioactive elements in the drinking water in some places and things of that sort. But the actual permitting,
Yeah.
the analysis and the permitting and the approval of design of nuclear energy related with the Nuclear Power Commission. And the senator from Nevada, of course, was very concerned about the waste consequences. There was a waste repository in Nevada, Senator Reid.
Hmm.
And that has been a sorry history for the United States. There are many reasons for it. One reason often given is that every nuclear power plant was different. There was nothing like what the French have, which is a standard design that once approved, you can go ahead and construct similar plants.
Hmm.
Um, I have always myself been supportive of nuclear energy. I
Okay.
served on a board after I left EPA, which had two nuclear reactors in Texas,
Hmm.
Texas Utilities, 2,500 megawatts of power.
Yeah.
And if you're used to regulating pollution as EPA administrator, and you look at something that has 2,500 megawatts and doesn't have a bit of carbon dioxide, sulfur
That
dioxide,
sounds good.
NOx,
Yeah.
particulates,
Yeah.
it's hard not to love it.
Hmm.
And then you have to really have, I think, an excessive concern with safety. And I think it's very important to recognize that since 3 Mile Island, we have not had a significant nuclear accident.
Yeah.
And that's because the industry got together and policed the process themselves. And I can describe how they did it because it was very important to me in explaining to President Obama
Hmm.
what I was proposing at the Oil Spill Commission
Hmm.
to respond to deep water drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. And I
Yeah.
remember he asked me, he said, I told him how it was done in the nuclear field,
Yeah.
where annually nuclear energy commissions or companies must report their score
Hmm.
and must be subject to a very detailed and onerous review.
Yeah.
And they are graded 1 through 5. And if they are graded 5, they are typically denied insurance and the senior management is fired.
Hmm.
It doesn't happen very often, but a 4 is also not so good.
Yeah.
And there is an annual meeting, it's called the Walk of Shame, at which the company that may have gotten a 4, poor rating, has to explain why they got it and what they've done to make sure that it never happens again. And even those companies that get a 1 are not they're not allowed to publicize it except to the insurance industry and to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Hmm.
But believe me, they are utterly thrilled. Our company that we had owned when I was in the private sector
Yeah.
uh, was very proud of that. But one of the truisms I was told by one of the inspectors was, you can do everything the same this coming year, and you probably won't get a 1 because they up ratcheted the standard every year.
Yeah.
And it's a very rigorous judgment that their engineers. It's come out of the Navy. The Rickover Navy tried to deal with the fact that submarines. We were losing a submarine every 5 years in the
Hmm.
post-war period, and Rickover analyzed very carefully what the issue was and concluded it was the welders in Connecticut at the boat building company.
Yeah.
And we have not had a submarine accident since. Well, we have not had a nuclear accident since 3 Mile Island.
Yeah. So, I mean, so then, uh, right now with the surge in AI and the
Yeah.
demands for energy, both Google and Microsoft, especially, for the 3 Mile Island, that facility is, instead of now being, it was going to be decommissioned, and now they've invested a lot of money, and it
Yes.
will be activated by 2028, I believe.
With,
So,
res- with respect to the nuclear issue, I should say when I explained that analogy to President Obama,
yeah.
that we need to do something similar for the deep water oil drilling profession
Hmm.
sector. He said, "Well, who actually runs the INPO that regulates nuclear energy?" I
Yeah.
said, "The industry." And he said, "Well, why would anybody trust that?" And I
Yeah.
said, "Well, sir, you have just shut down 29 drilling wells at the cost of hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars to the industry because of the mistakes of one.
Hmm.
You may imagine the rest of the industry is furious. They are determined to police this process because they all stand to lose if one misbehaves.
Yeah.
BP did. And he didn't argue with that. And we went ahead and made the proposal, and the institution we recommended was established.
Okay. So, interesting. Now, under the IRA, a lot of these projects are being funded, and just speculating what happens next in the election. What do you think are going to be the implications?
I think people have spent a lot of time on that. And I know that I was in India with the U.S. India Climate Track 2 dialogue, which I am American co chair with Gina McCarthy.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, John Podesta used to be the chair until he went into the government again. And there was a risk officer, vice president of the Orsted Corporation. The
Yeah.
Orsted Corporation is the largest
Yes.
drilling, or rather
Oil. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
offshore wind
Oh, yeah.
constructor. And he said that there is a contract already drafted that will result in billions of dollars of investment by his company in offshore wind in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to him, "You're head of risk. It seems to me that that's kind of a risky proposition, betting
Yeah.
on the future, given
Yeah.
the election is uncertain." And he smiled and he said, "Actually, I said we have the contract. I didn't say we had signed it." He said, "It's slated for signature the day after the election is
Oh, I see.
confirmed."
Yeah.
So there's that. That's one preparation people are making.
Mm-hmm.
But some people are taking, people I know and trust, are taking consolation in the fact that something like 80% of the expenditures on infrastructure and in the IRA are in Republican counties, red counties, as they say. And expects that the members of Congress, whether or not they give the credit to President Biden for those expenditures, which they should,
Mm-hmm.
will not want to see them halted. And
Exactly.
it would be very wasteful in many cases. The money has been appropriated.
Yeah.
I know the private sector, when I go to meetings of private equity groups, one or
Mm-hmm.
two that I'm involved with as an investor, there's a lot of impatience because the companies actually have more projects lined up and ready to go that meet the criteria, but the money is not flowing. Well, the money isn't flowing because the states have to prove it too, and they're not in the habit of approving these big new
Ah,
infrastructure projects. And and the projects in some cases are exposed to lawsuits,
I
and
see.
particularly if it's transmission lines that are involved. Uh, People often in populated areas object to those.
Yeah.
So the country does have the problem that Senator Moynihan, bless his heart, recognized when he said there's a real question that whether America can still do big things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the IRA is a test of that,
Mm-hmm.
that proposition, that question.
Yeah. So let's back off a little bit. I also wanted to discuss some things going back in time to your time at the EPA. Under your administration, the acid rain program took effect, which was the trading program amongst utilities to, and allocating sulfur allowances and trading, and that had a big impact also in terms of a cost effective market based approach to regulations. So, what are your recollections on that, and how that also got adopted in the Kyoto Protocol, in the emissions trading program, the European, how,
Yes.
yeah. So, can
Well,
you tell me what your,
sure. Well, this was an innovation that had been discussed and researched for some time
yeah,
by the Resources for the Future
hmm,
organization, a
yeah,
Washington think tank.
yes,
And they were promoting things of that sort. And we had a model a little bit in lead removal. There was an element of it that looked like rights trading, pollution trading. But the idea of putting it in the law as a basic mechanism for performance was novel. And we did that with very strong encouragement of Environmental Defense Fund, but no other environmental organization really supported it. And when
yeah,
the environmental groups came in to meet with me, there would be 12 or 13 in the room.
yeah,
When it came time to discuss the acid rain proposal we were making, most of them kept quiet, and the
mhm,
EDF representative waxed eloquent and enthusiastic.
yeah,
And at any rate, it was it was kind of a Republican way into the issue. And there were people in the White House like Boyd and Gray, the counsel to the president, who were big enthusiasts for that measure, though not at all enthusiastic about the Clean Air Act and the other
mhm,
elements of it.
yeah,
It united our administration in doing something experimental and novel.
yeah,
And Lord, it worked. It worked so well. And there has been analysis done by some Harvard woman that uh, explains that it is absolutely the model of a
mhm,
successful self executing statute. She said, first of all, the pollutant is identified and it's sulfur dioxide and it's
yeah,
measured.
mhm,
It's measured and in each of the stacks, and there are sensors, and there's under mandatory reporting requirement to the
yeah,
Environmental Protection Agency. It isn't that the company has to report, it's automatically reported.
yeah,
And the agency gets these numbers, and if they are not in compliance, there are serious penalties. There are fines. I forget what it is per ton,
mhm.
but they are. And
Initially was it
self
2000?
executing quality means you don't have to have inspectors, which maybe in periods of budget cuts get cut and they
Mhm,
don't get around to inspecting as frequently as they might. It just happens. And
yeah,
it proved dramatically successful. We estimated EPA would cost between $600 and $800 a ton of sulfur dioxide removal. The utility industry, electric power industry, thought that it would be 1,400 to 1,600, and it came in under 100. And it's the power of the market. It all
yeah,
of a sudden that, together with the fact that we removed from the old Clean Air Act the 90% reduction requirement for coal, irrespective of how much sulfur was in the coal, you had
yeah,
to reach 90%.
yeah,
We removed that,
yeah,
and we simply made it a question of how clean the coal was. The coal had to be either significantly cleaner, it had to be the 90%
yeah,
achievement, or there had to be scrubbers
yeah,
to improve it. Well, that sprang loose the coal from the western states.
mhm,
And the Republican senators, particularly, I know, saw that. And all of a sudden, we had enthusiasm on the part of people who had not historically been very fond of environmental law.
yeah,
And
exactly.
the coalition of eastern state representatives, headed by John Dingell,
Mhm,
uh, were taken by surprise that that it had the effect essentially of devaluing high sulfur coal from West Virginia and Illinois,
mhm,
but valuing very much the coal from Utah and Wyoming and the rest. So that is a great testimony to simply setting the standard
mhm.
and requiring it be achieved, but not saying that coal
How?
is already pretty low in sulfur has to reduce it by 90%. That was intentionally put in there to protect West Virginia
Hmm.
coal.
Yeah.
Appropriations Committee chairman obviously was influential in that decision.
Yeah. And I think you also introduced the Chicago Board of Trade to run those auctions to reduce
Yes,
the
I remember. I
transaction.
remember at the time there was a question, and I know this proved important in the George W. Bush administration. I was asked by Condoleezza Rice uh, and Josh Bolten, who were both in the White House and aides to President George W. Bush, whether or not there had to be a ceiling
Hmm.
on total emissions of carbon dioxide for a statute like that to work
Yeah.
as it did with respect to acid rain. And I said, yes, of course it does, because it's traded.
Exactly.
And the investor wants to know, well, what's the market? And if there's no ceiling on it, it's
Hmm.
unclear how you get it valued.
Yeah. Exactly.
And they said, well, the president's against a ceiling. And I said, well, honestly, then you haven't done your job. You've got to explain to him how this works.
Yeah.
He never came around to it, never supported anything serious to reduce carbon dioxide.
Hmm.
But it works, and acid rain proved it. The Adirondacks and the forests of the Northeast and Maine and Canada, importantly, that was
Hmm.
the highest single priority they had with respect to U.S.-Canadian relations, was to
Yeah.
pass a law to reduce acid rain from mostly from the Ohio River Valley,
Yeah.
where the big power plants were putting out an awful lot of sulfur dioxides, and
Hmm.
it did what it was intended to do.
Yeah.
It was masterful.
Yeah.
And the Europeans, and I remember I had a lot of contacts with the Europeans. At first, they were contemptuous of us turning it over to the market, to the private sector. Oh, this can't work.
Yeah.
And they had the reaction that President Obama had when I reminded him of how the nuclear uh, problem had been dealt with. And later, they, as you just said, they came around, and in the Kyoto Protocol, they uh, put in pollution rights trading. They exempted a number of their industries from it, and they honestly set the bar too low, or I should say, maybe too high.
Hmm.
They did not clamp down enough to make a significant difference in the early years. They understood that finally, I think, and they got more serious.
Yeah.
There are also some issues that I was familiar with in Europe, of inspectors notifying companies when they're planning to inspect their
Oh,
plants.
oh, is that right?
Not exactly the kind of enforcement that I think is most effective.
Yeah, well, but definitely the model is working, and now voluntary carbon markets, all of that builds on the trading system and how it can be refined and how strict that should be, and the timelines and the
Yes.
temporal banking and those kind of issues. So, in terms of the international impact, and again, going to the US participation in the Rio summit, which is when you were there, right? In the Earth Summit in 92.
Well, the United States went to Rio with a sterling record of
Yeah.
initiatives and innovations.
Hmm.
Environmental impact statement, community right to know, um, pollution rights trading,
Hmm.
a whole series of initiatives that were pioneered in the United States and influenced other countries.
Yeah.
And was it Project 2020? Forgotten what it was called, but a series of commitments which countries agreed on there, largely driven by the United States,
Hmm.
with a very effective leadership by Buff Bolton from the State Department. And
Yeah.
I was chairman of the delegation, all of which got us nothing in the way of good press, because although we had been one of the first to propose a convention
Hmm.
on climate,
Yeah.
and the protocol was a subsidiary to that in Kyoto, we did not agree to go forward and reduce our carbon dioxide emissions by any specific amount. We did agree in the convention which we signed. President Bush was the first signatory of a developed country to sign that convention. He signed it in Rio. I was present. But we did not have it as a mandatory requirement. And the president considered that and decided, with the advice of all of his political advisors and his economics team, not to do it. I was a lonely holdout on that decision and regretted it. But that was his position. And he also, or the people around him, and I think the Interior Department had a lot to do with, opposed the Biological Diversity Convention. And that was kind of a double whammy of negative involvement for the United States.
Yeah.
And the reason for opposing it was the chemical industry and the pharmaceutical industry. Both were very worried about the restraints on use of natural products, and also the implicit disinterest or opposition to genetically modified organisms. That was the reason given. When I was in Rio, my team drafted an alternative interpretation that would have satisfied, according to the National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, would have satisfied those concerns. But it was leaked to the press. A secret memo, really labeled secret, to the president, was leaked to the press in what the reporter described as one of the most surprising efforts to damage a president that his agencies or his own people leaked in order to obstruct. And successfully, that was the end of that. So Rio turned out, from a press point of view, to be not catastrophic, but a very negative take on an administration which had been very supportive of the environment and also done some very innovative things with respect to climate. Every year we now have an assessment of how we're doing on climate, a very extensive and detailed one, and that was established by President Bush. And the research budgets of not just of EPA on climate, but of the National Science Foundation, and of the Oceanic Administration, and even NASA. All of that was geared during the Bush administration to reinforcing our understanding of the functioning of nature, and particularly how it was affected by human behavior. So those things all got done, and by and large, they were done with full public disclosure. There was one moment where the Budget Bureau and Richard Darman rewrote to some approved testimony by the scientist Hansen, and but they got caught at it, and it was pretty clear it wasn't going to happen again, because it was so painful and incriminating. But anyway, that Rio was a marvelous event in that so many countries assessed their capabilities with respect to the climate. And I can recall hearing Prime Minister saying, what does biodiversity mean? What is that convention all about? And so I had to learn. And, and it affected my own career post EPA. I had 5 ministers from developing countries that I recall. India was the most notable, but I also heard from the minister from Mexico, Malaysia, that, as one of them put it to me, but they all basically took the same position. They said, upper atmospheric ozone protection and climate change are very serious, and they didn't dispute that. But they said they're not responsible for deaths and illness in our country. And I said, what is? Water. Inadequate supplies of water, or dirty water, polluted water.
Local,
And you're
local.
not saying much about that. And
Yeah,
so I actually rewrote the speech
yeah,
I was going to give on the presentation of the United States.
yeah.
And one of my staff members of the team said, it's all well and good to indicate sympathy for this, but the question will come then to the president, well, what are you doing about it? And we don't have a program, nor was I authorized to say that we're going to allocate more funding to water cleanup in the developing world. But I then organized my own fund, a $300 million fund, to address water needs in developing countries,
Oh,
and felt very strongly, and still do today, that water
yeah.
is fundamental. And if you put water together with heat, the two are potentially very pernicious with respect to health,
Hmm.
to crops, to food, and to nature.
Yeah. And to like diseases, right? In the
Absolutely, yes.
purification. I mean, that's uh,
Yeah.
right there, the basic one. Um, and that's your work in the private equity world, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Oh, okay. Wow, what a
Seema, I used to talk about climate to audiences that didn't get it. It was not something that was in the currency of the country and their knowledge. And so I found that I was successful in a couple of speeches I gave in Virginia. I was living in Alexandria, Virginia, and I told them that cottonmouths were going to be in their farm ponds
yeah,
very soon. And that totally got their attention. They said, no, that's impossible. There are no cottonmouths in our farm ponds. And I said, well, they're in South Carolina, and climate change is going to give them an environment that they will like, and they'll move north. it,
yeah,
was, it was the only thing that seemed to resonate with any number of the people in the country
yeah,
where I was speaking at the time.
yeah. Well, I mean, now climate change is like the pressing problem. Of course, there are even bigger problems now of our own creation, even. But
But as you
climate,
say, it wasn't just cottonmouths; it's dengue fever,
yeah, yeah,
and it's diseases of the sort and malarias that,
yeah,
or rather, mosquitoes that carry these diseases
mhm,
that the new heat environment will favor.
yeah.
They will prosper.
They will prosper. Yes. Um, so now I think we'll just go to a few questions in terms of what are your what is your biggest achievement that uh, just a few um,
Well, I did a couple of things that turned out to be highly consequential,
mhm,
and I look back and I try to recall whether I was aware at the time. I guess I was. But one of those was the establishment of the Initiative for Environmental Justice, I think we call it, or environmental equity. And it now has 140 some staff. It draws attention to what struck me as the very obvious reality and unfairness that
mhm.
minorities and the poor are subjected to a higher level of damage from pollution
Yeah.
than anyone else, whether it's air pollution, mostly air pollution,
Mhm.
but also water and
Yeah.
waste.
Yeah.
And so President Biden has required that there be a specific analysis in most major decisions, particularly
Right.
infrastructure decisions,
Mhm.
of the consequences for that population.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important,
Mhm.
but it's clear that the project 2025 that will apparently characterize the Trump administration, if Donald Trump is elected president, does away with that, or they say they will merge it with the administrative department, the administrative offices of the agency, and I think that means that's the end of it, which is very regrettable
Mhm.
because it addresses a real
Yes.
problem, a
Yeah.
reality.
Mhm.
But I'm proud of that. And a second thing that I feel very good at, well, there are really several, but the Clean Air Act, of course, was a magnificent achievement, and certainly wasn't just mine.
Yeah.
The president broke a stalemate that was at least 12 years in the making, and Senator George Mitchell told me not that long ago, a couple of years ago, that he was very surprised that we succeeded in getting that law passed. He
Yeah.
hadn't gotten anything through, and he was this champion. He was also very important to the fact that we did get it passed, but he couldn't do it until the president put up his clean air initiative.
Yeah.
The other thing that we did was I did a specific finding that side stream smoke is a Class A carcinogen, and I had been concerned about um, in interior pollution
Yeah.
for a long time. The oddity of the Clean Air Act is 90% of the time people spend is indoors, and the Clean Air Act doesn't touch it.
Mm.
It's concerned with outdoor air. Well, side stream smoke is mostly an indoor problem. And we did the research, we were working on it. This is something that we intended to do. And Bill Rosenberg was the assistant administrator for air, and he felt strongly about it. I felt strongly about it. And as we got to the closing of the research, and it proved difficult, by the way, to find populations that did not have evidence of tobacco in their lungs. We all had it, whether we smoked or not. And I can still remember flight attendants coming to talk to me when they discovered that I was EPA administrator and saying, please, we've seen the filters
Yeah.
in the aircraft,
Mm.
and we fear that our lungs are equally clogged
Oh my God.
with
Yeah, because they're in a
tobacco.
total constriction.
Well, the last official, I think, regulatory, it wasn't a regulatory decision, it was a finding, scientific finding I made was that side stream smoke is a Class A carcinogen. And I invited the Secretary of Health to come over and stand with me as he used to wear a little button that had a cigarette with a line through it. And I remember in the press conference, one question was asked, do you think tobacco should be prohibited? Should it be contraband? And I thought, oh, Lord, I cannot have that come out of this press conference. And Lou Sullivan was a good sport. He didn't respond because he did believe that. And I said, this is America, and we allow a lot of risk and selection of risk and individual choice in this country. People jump out of airplanes and they ride motorcycles and they deep sea dive.
Yeah.
All of those things. That's because it's America and we're free. But side stream smoke inflicts your activity, if you're smoking, on someone else who did not volunteer to have that exposure.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Seema, within 1 year, something like almost 500 towns and cities across the United States forbade smoking in their public buildings, and then pretty much forbade them in buildings in general.
Yeah.
And that was evidence, because I didn't have regulatory power to do anything there.
Mm-hmm.
That was evidence of the trust the country had in EPA.
Yeah.
Nobody really, the tobacco industry filed lawsuits, and we went through that, of course. And I remember I decided to communicate this to the rest of the world. I've spent a lot of time in other countries. I went to school in both France and Germany, and was in the army in Germany. Wrote a book about French land use. And so I gave a presentation. Voice of America picked it up, and Radio Free Europe, I think, also. And I did it in French, Spanish, and German. And I remember the French response to this was not encouraging. They had full page ads showing gorgeous models arrayed, in various alluring poses, all with cigarettes or cigars or pipes in their hands. And it was just like, go pound sand. We're not paying any attention to you. And I remember I was with my young daughter in Paris. She was working there one summer, and we were in an area where there were a lot of fashion houses. And so the place where we were having lunch was just filled with models. And these beautiful women are all smoking. And I said to my daughter, I said, do they not believe science here? And she said, "Don't you know why they're smoking?" I said, "No." She said, "For weight control." And I remember I was called twice by the White House and told not to issue that report.
Yeah.
And each time I said to the person who called me, Clayton Yiter was a very good man and who'd been an excellent agriculture secretary. I said, my decisions go into court if they're significant, and this is a big one.
Yeah.
You don't want me to have to say I got a call telling me not to do it
Yeah.
by the White House. And but they called me a second time, and I remember explaining that I had very carefully organized the timing of this decision so that the research went to the Science Advisory Board, I, I think just after the election,
Mm-hmm.
and it came up to me for decision in early January. And I didn't say it's after the election, but I was trying to let him understand that he had said there were 5 governors who got wind of this decision and they were very concerned. They had tobacco interest in their states.
Yeah.
But the ability, and the one person who reacted very favorably to it, I thought it was favorable to it. She
Mm-hmm.
didn't mention it, but it was Barbara Bush.
Oh.
Barbara Bush told me a story. She said Jane Pauley um, said on the air, I guess asked her on the air, how does it feel to look like you're old enough to be his mother, the president?
Oh. Huh.
And she said, as I think she has written, that was the most painful thing that ever the press put her into. But she said, I would like American girls and women to understand the reason that I prematurely aged was because I was a chain smoker. And she said, I just wish they could understand that. And I've often thought back on that. I thought that was her way of saying, if whether she even knew that I was getting pushback from the White House,
She
she made
wanted you
pretty
to go
clear
ahead.
she
Yeah.
liked that decision.
Oh, that is really great of her to say that. And yeah. Wow. So, lot of great accomplishments. And well, I should just ask you: is there anything that you feel like you could have done?
Oh, I was just thinking there's another lovely story about Barbara Bush. The
Yeah.
day after my appointment was announced, the president invited us to lunch along with Lou Sullivan and his wife, the health secretary.
Mm-hmm.
And we got to the dessert, and President Bush looked up over his reading glasses and said, some of us might do better not to have a fatty dessert. And she said back to him, quick as a flash, she said, nonsense. My constituents like me fat. And then she turned to me. She said, environmentalists particularly seem to like me fat. Bill, why do you suppose that is? And I thought, boy, this could be a career-ending answer. and I said, environmentalists are into authenticity, Mrs. Bush.
Exactly. Exactly. And also, it's their choice, right? As well.
In terms of in terms of regrets, uh, I regret very much that President Bush did not commit to specific uh, CO2 reductions
Yeah.
and to proposing law to effect that.
Mm-hmm.
The law that he did sign, the Convention on Climate, has a moral uh, commitment to reduce greenhouse gases, to reduce carbon dioxide, but it's not a legal one and it's not specific in terms of numbers. For
Yeah.
4 years, developed countries pressed the United States of these conferences that are regular conferences of the parties to agree to a 10% reduction. Some wanted a 20% reduction in CO2. Uh, Chief of Staff controlled the delegation there. It took it away from the State Department. So it really came right out of the White House.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I made too little of it to the president. I should have gone straight to the president and reminded him that we were in a minority of one with most of our allies. And that continued for those 4 years. And when finally he made a very specific decision not to agree to the proposal from the rest of the world, he was within a few days very surprised to find himself alone.
In the minor,
And
yeah.
he actually said to us at lunch, several of us, tell me again, why is it we can't do this climate thing that the whole developed world is doing?
Yeah.
And it's a little bit complicated how he failed to pay attention, I guess, or remember that he and I had a very long lunch where I went over what everybody was going to do. I kind of regret that I didn't go straight to Chancellor Kohl, whom he respected. Chancellor Kohl and I had met early in our term. I remember he had asked the president, how do I follow up? We were in the base of the Louvre, and President Mitterrand of France was taking us down to see the new archaeology they had covered dating back to the founding of Paris. And we were all walking along, and the chancellor said to the president, how do I follow up on the environmental commitments in this? And he said, see Reilly. And the chancellor dropped back and he said, Ich brauche Ihre Karte. And that means in German, I need your card.
Yeah.
Well, momentarily, I started to reach for a business card, and then it occurred to me, the Chancellor of Germany is not asking for my business card. And I later learned from our ambassador to Germany, Vernon Walters, who was a linguist, that in Rhenish, it meant, I need your help. So he invited me to come visit with him, and I met with him. I'll never forget the stirring farewell he gave me. I was told by the ambassador he gave me more time than any American had ever gotten from the chancellor. But he stood and he said, on your country and mine, Mr. Reilly, depends our saving the planet from a climate catastrophe.
Yes.
And on your shoulders rests the responsibility to bring your president to understand the significance of this issue. And it was a stirring statement. Yeah. And I've wondered if had I called him and asked him to place a call to President Bush. I had done that once before with respect to funding developing countries to comply with the ozone protocol, the Montreal Protocol. I had been told by this kind of jury, just all sitting together, and I was in front of them, the Treasury Secretary, the Budget Director, and and there was the Budget Director, and I've forgotten who the third was. Oh, the Chief of Staff, Sununu. They're all together, and they said there's no way they were going to provide that funding. And I said, if you don't provide it, the developing country will not get rid of CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. Yeah. And I remember they asked me the question. They said, well, how can they afford to, given the health consequences? And I said, well, I quote the Environment Minister of India, who said, Indians have more to worry about than skin cancer of white people in the developed world. That's exactly what she said. So I went out and I remember thinking, well, how do I overcome that? The Chief of Staff, the Treasury Secretary, and the Budget Director all. And then I thought, well, I have a relationship with Margaret Thatcher, and I was told that I was one of her favorites. We'd worked together on some things. So I called her up, and within a day, President Bush made the decision to provide the funds. It was, I think, $500 million. Yeah. So, and I think the Chief of Staff and the rest of them never knew what hit them. They didn't know how that happened, and I certainly didn't tell. Yeah. I kind of regret, but I don't know if it would have made a difference. I have asked George Mitchell a couple of years ago if President Bush had declared for reductions in serious legislation in CO2 from the American economy, could we have passed it? And he said, no, I don't think so. He said, on the other hand, I didn't think you'd get the Clean Air Act through, and you surprised me. So, but he said no. Well, the thing about Bush having proposed it, even if it didn't pass, it possibly would have taken some of the partisanship out of the discussions of the issue in the period since, because we have apparently doubled our CO2 aggregate emissions in the period since that was under consideration, and President Bush in 1992 made that decision not to go forward to reduce greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
It would have been a very healthy injection into the discourse. And that is a regret of mine. I keep thinking or have thought, what
Yeah.
else might I have done? But on the other hand, to be realistic, the whole weight of the president's economics team, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and the budget director and the rest, and his political advisors were against his making that commitment.
Yes. Well, I think right now the trajectory hopefully is in the direction that we now pay attention to these issues.
There is polling data, and it's been repeated several times, of Americans' attitudes on climate, and something like 80% or more believe that climate is a serious problem,
Yes.
and many of them, most of them, that it is human caused or contributed to, and that many of them believe that we should even go further and trying to address it, trying to remedy it. And environmentalists take a lot of comfort in that sometimes, and one hears it in speeches.
Yeah.
And yet, we're about to have an election in which very close to 50% or maybe more of the electorate is going to vote for someone who considers it a hoax, a fraud,
Hmm.
and who does not accept the science and will not make any specific policy priorities intended to address climate.
Yeah.
So it's a discouraging thing with respect to public understanding that it's still not in the consciousness of the public in the way that air pollution was in 1970, for example.
Yeah. It's one thing to be environmentally conscious, but now wildfires, hurricanes, people are having risk of losing their homes, and that this has happened in coastal communities.
Yes.
Uh, so the risks to the real estate, risk on the bank's balance sheets for a number of properties that are being subject to climate risks is not something up in the air. It's very real. And I think, irrespective of whichever president, I think that should not be ignored at all, because a lot of these risks have been kind of predicted before. Even in countries like the smaller island communities were preparing climate mitigation. They were asking for funds for sea
Yeah.
level rise. And for America to be not aware of that, I was used to be in Washington, spend some summers there, and I was at the World Bank. This resilience on the part of developing countries preparing. But if we have the same kind of preparation should be there for the US, right? In terms of the acknowledgement and uh, risks that are very apparent right now. I mean, it's not even a question about science, because it's playing out the effects in people's lives and their
Well,
assessment.
you and I know that, believe that, and
Yeah,
we believe the science.
yeah,
And yet, you have a state like Florida, whose real estate
yeah,
market, I think, could well collapse in the next 5 to 10 years.
yeah,
Insurance is being withdrawn. People, if you
exactly.
can't get insurance, you
Yeah,
can't get a mortgage. So the real
yeah,
estate economy there might be in serious peril. And yet, the
exactly.
governor of
Yeah, yeah,
Florida does not believe in the science of climate change
yeah,
and does not allow global warming and some other related phrases even to be used in state
yeah,
issuance publications. It's the fact that that can still happen, that can still be true in probably the one of the most exposed states to the problem, to
yeah,
the developing climate, says that the country is just still not getting it.
yeah. And right now, climate risk is so important that, the SEC passed climate disclosure rules, which requires companies to tell how much scope 1 emissions are being emitted, scope 2,
Yes.
and emissions in their supply chain. And going back to the disclosure for toxics, as soon as there are disclosure laws, and the disclosure laws are basically, in this case, they have to be verified and audited because,
Hmm.
we're talking about the SEC. That's where you actually will get a good idea of the risks that the company is facing, just like any other risks that a company is facing, right? And so the risk and even the opportunities, once they are reported, then companies can make good decisions, get rid of the risk, and it helps because it's more information which is required. And to kind of ignore that is not very smart
No,
risk
I agree.
assessment. I mean, it's, as you said, the insurance markets, the real estate market is very tied to where these risks are. And going back to all the way back to President Nixon, the no, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration was also brought into existence, I think, in 1970, and
Yes.
that's the place where people are looking at all these storm impacts and hurricanes, and so all that information, there's more need of that now than ever before, and it would be a complete folly to ignore that, um, at least in terms of the climate. And you're right. I mean, which administration really um, wins? It's a real impact on climate situation, and um, it's a real cause for concern.
And there is a proposal to get rid of the Weather Bureau in NOAA that
Oh,
is part of the project
is that right?
2025. That's what I understand.
Oh, wow.
I'm not
Okay.
sure. I'm not sure why, but maybe because it touts climate too consistently. I don't know what the other objections could be.
Yeah. Well, okay. So your favorite EPA administrator, other than yourself?
Well, I guess I mean I was very close to Russell Train, and I've had so many positions actually that he's
Yeah.
had. President of the Conservation Foundation, President of World Wildlife Fund, Chairman of World Wildlife Fund. But I think I would have to say that that Bill Ruckelshaus established the agency as strong, committed,
Yeah.
honest, and trustworthy, and independent.
Yeah.
And given that he was the first administrator,
I think.
the standard was set well. It
Yeah.
was there had been a proposal. In fact, an offer was made to the president of Ford Motor Company
Hmm.
to become EPA administrator, and he said that it wouldn't be appropriate that
Yeah.
someone in a heavily regulated field implicated in the problems that were trying to be corrected for.
Hmm.
So he turned it down, and Ruckelshaus was chosen. I think he was recommended by the Attorney General. I think he was then the Assistant Attorney General for Criminal in the Justice Department,
Yeah.
and that was a brilliant choice. He was energetic and vigorous
Hmm.
and straight as an arrow. Just really. I've always looked up to him. With both he and Train had statesman-like qualities that we should hope public service continues to command.
Hmm.
I talked to someone the other day, a very impressive figure who's been important in philanthropy and also in finance. And he said of his four children, now in their 30s,
Hmm.
not one of them showed the slightest inclination to consider public service.
Oh, is that
And
right?
I thought, in my time, when I made the choice, it was an ennobling profession,
Yeah.
and it was revered even. One thinks of the Peace Corps. I remember I was always proud that the APA had more Peace Corps veterans than any agency of the government.
Yeah.
And you have to really be committed to go to the Peace Corps. You don't burnish your CV if you're in it, and you don't certainly make any money.
Yeah.
Uh, and I thought that these are very committed folk.
Hmm.
And I would hope that we could restore confidence in public service. It's has to be done from the top.
Yeah. Very true. Well, on that note, I really want to thank you so much. Is there anything that we are missing that you want to say?
Oh, I think you and I could talk all day.
That is very true, and maybe we will. I think we have. a lot of shared interests. I really appreciate the fact that you gave us all the insights into policy, the history of sustainability, and specifically the inner workings of how the EPA administrator and the EPA, how it works in conjunction with all the agencies and with the president, and how you all come up with the policies that strengthen our environment and communities. And thank you so much for your service, and thank you so much for talking to me, and we'll meet again.
We will meet again. And thank you, Seema, for these probing questions.
Yeah. Uh, all right. Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Bye bye.